rolling. Problem with making a tea is, of course, it could really do with brewing for a while. So this is the first 5 minutes of the video, tea brewing. Tell you what I'm going to do. Rather than have the tea, I'm going to leave it brewing, and then it'll be a reward when I finish this video. So let's go and have a look what's going on. So we'll start with Mustang, I think. So I think last week we showed that the axle casing had just come back from powder coat. So Trev's just in the process of building that up now. You see we've got the back plates on here, the drum assemblies, and Gaz is just painting the differential. So the actual differential unit came to us completely built, and that essentially just bolts in. So rather than completely strip that down and powder coat it, we use a polyurethane paint on that, which is really tough. And for the area of the diff that's not as susceptible to stone chipping, be absolutely fine. So that's that. Whilst Gaz was painting those, he's also painting some bracketry for the engine for the Mustang. So when this engine was built elsewhere, I forget the name of the company now, but we mentioned it in the previous episode. It came to us with a nice polished alternator. We also had a bracket set for that alternator, but it had none of the rest of the auxiliary drive components on it. Now we've got a new power steering pump on the way of just the original type. And originally the car had one of these rather ugly, horrible looking aircon compressors on it for the original aircon setup. And we were kind of keen to get rid of that and tidy up the brackets that held all of that. So we've got a nice polished Sanden air compressor for the aircon system, which is a bit more attractive than the original. That basically sits up here somewhere. And then we've got bracket sets from Vintage Air to mount the original power steering pump and the aircon compressor. And Trev yesterday did a quick mock-up of all those brackets to make sure all that lot fitted, which it did. And those brackets have just been painted with the same urethane paint we were painting the diff with. The only other change on this is the alternator bracket. It came with a machine bracket for the alternator which didn't fit, and it appears that the mounts, one of them's onto the head and two are onto the block essentially via the water pump, and the relative positions of those wasn't the same. Now I don't know if that's that the block has been skimmed more, or the heads, because their aftermarket heads are a different shape, but regardless, none of the holes in the bracket are slotted and the holes don't line up. So we've just drawn up our own bracket, plasma cut that, and that's being painted along with the other bits. So as soon as the paint's dry on those, we'll have all the bracketry ready to put all the auxiliary drive components together on that. So that will kind of be the finishing touch on that engine. And we're actually getting quite close to the point that we could get that in the car. That's obviously what we're working towards, with the axle having been powder coated and now being built. All of the front suspension components are ready to go. Engine and transmission's now ready to go. So I think that's more or less everything ready to come together on that. I don't exactly know when we're going to get that in here and make that happen, but I would say by next week we've got all the elements in place to actually get it bolted together and get that car rolling with its engine and transmission in. So that's the Mustang. Manta, Clive has been on with two things on that. He's been doing the exhaust system, or starting with the manifold, so he's done the complicated bit at the front, which was always going to be the biggest challenge on this. Very little space, as I think Nat's mentioned before. So what we're doing is bringing the manifolds forward. We've used slightly modified Range Rover P38 tubular manifolds that come forwards on the car, and then the offside one comes around the front of the engine. The near side one loops forward and then meets it in a 2-into-1 collector, which sits forward of the near side engine mount. And then the really tight bit is then threading the one, which I think we've run it in 2 3/4 inch on this. As a bit of a compromise. 3 inch would be ideal for the power, 2 1/2 better for the fit and actually threading it through all the tight bits. So we kind of compromised at 2 3/4 inch, and that's going to feed under the near side engine mount, and that's basically where Clive's got to on this. This is then waiting to go on the ramp to finish the rest of that system, and in the meantime he's been working on the heater box arrangement. So we wanted to keep the standard Manta heater system. And when we did the original engine mock-up on this, which was actually a few years ago, if you kind of follow this series, you'll know that this car was on hold for a while. And we did mock up the heater box in there, but we knew the matrix was going to need some modifications and there might be a bit of tweaking to the heater box itself. So that's what Clyde's on with at the minute, and he's basically trimmed down the plastic box to make the part where the heater matrix slips into it slightly shorter. We're then going to have a custom matrix made, which is probably 20mm shorter than the original. But for the moment, he's just cut the back off an old matrix to get it into the position. And then to neatly finish the front of that heater box, A, because we've cut it down slightly, and B, because the original plastic retainer for the heater matrix is a horrible, it just doesn't look a pretty looking thing. It originally had sort of rubberized sound deadening around it, which isn't an attractive look really. So he's done this beautiful little fabricated, polished stainless steel cover that retains that heater matrix, just to properly retain it with the modifications and also look nice. So that's where we're at on the Manta. Let's have a little wander this way. Make sure you don't trip over that exhaust, Jamie. Utah, James last week was just finishing off the central locking installation, which is done. And then he was making a start on the armrests, which are now also done. So Nat mentioned about the fact we'd done these 3D printed armrest / pull handles for the doors. We needed a way to attach those that were strong and didn't have any visible fasteners. So we made these stainless steel plates that have angled threaded bosses welded to them, and then the bolts go up into these holes at the bottom at an angle and bolt them onto those plates, and then in turn the plates have got studs welded to them which slot through holes which is now put into the inner door frame, and that essentially bolts that plate into place. So what will happen is the plate will be bolted on first, the door card will go over the top, and we've obviously used welded studs so there's no heads on bolts here to hold the door card off the door panel, and then once the door card's in place, the handle itself will then be bolted through into this plate, and of course the whole lot will be upholstered. So this armrest will be leathered, and the door cards, which you saw us making in a previous episode, will be leathered as well. So it's nice to kind of get that job ticked off, because there's just that allows the remaining upholstery work to be done. So Dean was patterning for the carpets last time. I know he's making those as we speak, and then he's going to be moving on to leathering the door cards and the door handles. And actually at that point, the number of upholstery jobs is getting very small. I think we've got the parcel shelf still to do and some of the components for the centre console, but not a lot of upholstery work left to do on that. One thing I couldn't remember whether we'd shown this before or not. I don't think we did. When we planned all of the brake system on this, we decided to use a Jaguar X300 XJ servo and master cylinder. And originally when we kind of did the rough installation, we had the original plastic reservoir for it, and immediately that just stood out as looking terrible and basically letting the look of the engine bay down. So we decided to design our own reservoir and have that machined from aluminium billet. So that is the lid for that reservoir, and then the base part's obviously just trial fitted on there at the minute. The idea for this was that we wanted to mimic loosely the design of the rocker covers, which is basically a machined flange with little dome nuts that go on there, which in turn we'd chosen to try and mimic a little the old Jag XK6 engine. So it'll be the same on this, but miniaturised. It's got these little scalloped out sections, M4 studs on the lower part, and there'll be M4 dome nuts holding that down. And this is going to be black anodised. So that'll be the next process for that. And because we always try and tie those finishing processes and coating processes together, try and get big batches because there's usually minimum orders, we're trying to tie together a number of anodising jobs. So that ties in with the Stratos. You may remember, I think 2 weeks ago, the last episode I did, we just got the screen bracket and mount, the part that mounts it up from the column, and the plate that then goes onto that to mount the digital screen in front of the steering wheel. We'd got those back from machining, and we want to then send them off for black anodising. But we've got some trial fitting to do with the column shroud. So that mount bolts to the column, and then we've 3D printed an upper column shroud, which works with the Fiat X19 steering column that's in this, and has the necessary cutouts for that screen mount. But we wanted to fettle and fit those cutouts to be an exact fit, and have everything trial fitted in there first, before we then finalise that and say, yeah, that's ready for upholstery. And it made sense to anodise that mount after we'd done that, so we didn't risk scratching the anodising. So Trev's been on with doing that whole mock-up fit of the 3D printed column shroud with the machined screen mount. That's all okay, looking good. So that'll be going off for anodizing along with the reservoir parts on that, and a couple of other bits. I'm trying to think what the other parts for anodizing was. Well, the back plate, I can see Trev's just working on the back plate for the throttle body, or the air filter that goes onto the throttle bodies on Utah. So he's just welded in a boss for the air temp sensor, and he's just in the process of sanding and finishing it and giving it a bit of a brushed finish, which that will then go away for black anodizing as well. So I think that's everything in here. So let's carry on through here and see what else is going on. Plenty of t-shirts and hoodies in stock at the moment, so go onto the website retropower.co.uk and you can buy those there. Hey, look at that. Secret project. Nice Simca, yeah. So moving on to the Jensen. I know last week Nat went into reasonable detail on what they've been working on that. It was the first time they'd actually got the body fitted over, which is always a bit of an exciting motivational booster. When you've seen it just as a bare chassis for so long, you start to kind of lose sight of what the end result's going to be. So it was awesome to see the body on. But then that initial joy of the body being on is quite quickly broken by the fact you've got to take it on and off about 20 times to get the fit to be anything like how it should. If you think back to when we started this project, the chassis was essentially replaced with a completely restored chassis. So it is no longer the original chassis. And of course, this was the first time we'd mated up the body with the new chassis, and that was never going to be an immediate fit. So there's been a reasonable amount of work involved in tweaking details on the chassis to mate up correctly with the body. There's a little bit of tweaking to do on the body side frames, but you can sort of see more clearly now how it all goes together in terms of the body side frames, which we repaired, being attached along the sill to the main chassis structure, and then you can almost not see now where the join is, but the body side frame sits up along that A-pillar and around the window aperture there, and it's basically what forms the perimeter of the door and window aperture. And kind of with that in mind, one of the steps we're looking at now is getting the door frames fitted up. We've obviously now repaired all the door frame, but it's at the moment unskinned. And of course you can basically make the skin whatever shape it needs to be to fill the gap. But you need to make sure that the frame fits into the aperture on the side there. That's kind of the critical fitting point, is that the hinges go on, the latch lines up, and that with all of that in place, the actual window frame, when it's bolted up correctly to this, sits in the right place versus the window aperture, so that it seals correctly against its seals and obviously looks correct. So that's really the determining factor, is that we get this assembly built up with the frame, get it bolted on, and then work out, whether we can get the alignment right with shimming, getting the position of the latch right. And once it works, sits correctly and opens and shuts and latches as a frame, then we can worry about making the skin for that. And then at that point we can confidently make the skin fit the gap, knowing that the rest of the functional part of it actually works as it should. Another thing that's going to be quite handy while we've got this open is that we're going to be putting electric windows in this. You can see the manual lifter part of it here. So what we're going to do while we've got this apart is actually find a suitable electric lifter that's of a similar pivoting arm type. And then what we'll do is we'll refabricate this plate section, this bracket, which all this serves to do is mount the original window lifter mech. So we'll refabricate that to fit a suitable electric mechanism, so we get the electric window lifting. Actually, starting from the front, the initial mock-up of all the bonnet fitment. On these, the bonnet hinges are at the back, which I forgot the other week, thinking it was momentarily a flip front. There's a structure that sits at the front. The reason for that really is that there's a structure that sits up behind the radiator, a metal frame, and it's got two sort of plastic round bushes on it, and at a glance they look for all the world like there'd be a pivot bush for a forward hinging bonnet, but they're actually the latching mechanism. It's one of the cool features of this car. I don't know if you can think back to when we first got this delivered. There's a little flap up, key open flap on the bonnet, and under that is a big lever which you pull to one side, and that unlatches the bonnet. Now what that actually does is pull two bolts inward, which go into those plastic bushes on the front frame. So we've been getting that structure into place, making sure that all still works with the bonnet, and the bonnet frame, which is the fiberglass bonnet, is attached to a steel tube frame, which is really quite a basic frame, but it's quite a good technique because there's a lot of adjustment between the frame and the bonnet, which means you can get all the positioning perfect in terms of the gaps without having to totally redesign all the bonnet hinge arrangement. So that structure that sits onto the front there is all Jensen CV8, but it has bracing bars that come down to the main cross member, which now on this car is Jensen Interceptor. So that frame no longer mates up with the cross member. So one of our next jobs on that is essentially going to be refabricating that frame so it mates up with the Jensen Interceptor cross member and making some provision on the cross member for that to bolt to. So that's one of the next steps on the front. And then the guys at the moment are just carrying on with the body fitment. You can also see some sign of what's to come on the body in terms of we've started making some inroads into losing bits that we know we're going to be reshaping. So Nat hinted last week at the fact that there was going to be some revision to the body structure, and that revision is that we're incorporating a number of cosmetic changes into it, but subsequently to that we're going to be pulling a mould from it and doing a carbon fibre body. So the changes we're making are reasonably subtle, but we're hoping they're subtle but effective in creating the look that we want. We're always convinced that it's a little bit slabby in this area here. It's almost like the balance top to bottom is not as pleasing as it could be. It seems quite light up here and quite heavy down the bottom here, and the same at the back. So what we're planning on doing is revising this shape here subtly to pull it in a little tighter here, so this line here tapers up a little more than it did, and the rear valance shape will be tighter in like this than it used to be, just to sort of lighten the balance down here. And then at the top here, I think we're just going to add a slight extra bulge in this area here. Not a lot, but if you were being critical, as we tend to be, it seems a little flat here, as if that horn should just come out a little deeper. So we're going to look at reshaping that. So one of the next phases on this, apart from all the continuing metalwork on the chassis, is going to be starting to sculpt how we want these shapes to be, with a view to eventually, after no doubt many weeks of sculpting work, taking a mould from this to then make a new body with that revised shape incorporated into it. And it'll just be a nice opportunity at that point to have a completely new body rather than relying on, God, how old is this car? It must be 40. How old is this car now? What year is it? 60 something, isn't it? But,
yeah, I think it's 68.
so how old is that then? It's got to be 50 years old? 40 years old? 50 years old. Yeah, so 50-year-old fiberglass, there's always a slight concern about that. So with the opportunity to make a completely new body with modern materials, it seems daft to pass up on that opportunity, especially considering there's so many changes we want to incorporate anyway, which our decision, were we not making a new body, would be, we'd have to make new sections in fiberglass and actually graft them into the original body. So then we'd have a mixture of new fiberglass, old fiberglass, various join lines on it. There's also quite a lot of previous damage on this body. You can see where this whole side has been recreated after an accident. There would be a lot of question marks over whether there would be any issues further down the line in terms of paint cracking and that sort of thing. So it's just nice to have the opportunity to start with a complete clean slate in terms of a new body. So that's the route we're going. So that's basically where we're at on that. If you follow me this way, Scott has been on with the Morris. So we were looking last week at the area, in the back seat area, shall we say. This car's not having a back seat, so that area back there we were making use of to mount the remote servo and the battery, which is now done. And last week, and that looked at the fact he was making the cover panels to go over that. And there was a little bit of thinking in so much as we didn't really want any visible fasteners on that. And we needed somewhere to put some speakers, and we realised there would be just enough room to get the depth of the speakers in above those components. So what we decided to do was make a metal frame in there that actually bolts in. That will sit under the cover panel, and then there'll be a pin at the top of the cover panel to stop the top edge of it flapping. But then the main thing holding the cover panel down will actually be those speakers. So the speakers pin the cover panel down to those brackets, and then there are bolts at the very bottom front edge, but they're fairly hidden away. And then the way the speakers fit is that you bolt them in and then the grills go in afterwards, so then they hide those bolts, so it will be attaching those cover panels there. So that's all finished now. Scott's then moved on to some of the front end. So he's been doing the radiator mounting. This is just a dummy radiator. We've used this technique quite a lot, where we just fabricate a steel frame that represents the shape of the radiator and the mounting points. So we can do all the bracketry without risking damaging an actual radiator, and then when we're done, we'll send that dummy frame off to Concept Racing, who do our aluminium radiator fabrication, and then they can use that as a model to then build a radiator around that envelope. The next things on the front here are going to be also the aircon condenser and oil cooler mount. So they've actually just arrived today, so we can do that. And we're going to have an aircon condenser sort of offset to one side here, and then a vertically mounted oil cooler the other side. Moving on from that, Scott did these infill sections of inner wing here. That was probably the last bit of the inner wing structure which we hadn't quite got around to finishing, is this fillet in here. So he's done those both sides. We've done the fuel pressure regulator mount, which is just down here, mounted off the chassis under the throttle bodies. Keeps it reasonably out of sight. You can still reach it to adjust it, and that's exactly where we wanted it in terms of the pipe run. So we had a planning meeting a few weeks ago, which I think we've mentioned before, to basically plan all of the remaining metalwork jobs on the car. And that's when we get down to thinking about things like where the brake lines are going to run, where the clutch lines are going to run, where the fuel lines are going to run. So at this stage we can then put all the mounting points in for those, so we know where that fuel line plumbing is going to go, and that was taken into account when we were considering the position for that regulator. What else have we been doing on that throttle pedal? We've got a Tilton pendulum mount pedal box in this, which there was mounting provision put into the chassis for the main part of the pedal box. Now the throttle pedal mounts off the side of that, but we weren't mad keen on the distance that sits from the other pedal. It seems to sit unnecessarily far away. So we're having a bit of a rethink on that, and we also wanted to change the way the cable actuation works. The sort of off-the-shelf Tilton cable linkage pulls down, and it would be nice if the cable was pulling forwards. So rather than using the Tilton linkage, we're going to make an extension off the top of the pedal, so that it becomes basically a front pull cable on it. So Scott's just in the process of making a mounting for that throttle pedal, and then once we've done that, we're going to make an extension off the top of the pedal to convert it to front pull, and then the cable will just come through the bulkhead, just sneaking under or next to the air filter here, to loop round to the linkage, which will be mounted on, I can't remember if that's going to go under the throttle bodies or on top, but basically it'll be a front entry cable onto the throttle bodies. So he's been working on that, and I think the last thing he's been working on this is the front speakers. We want some speakers mounted down in the kick panels there. We also wanted a method of mounting the actual trim panels into those kick panel areas. And there was a third factor in that, in the battery cable and wiring loom routing, which we want to bring down the sill, which is a hollow section. The battery cable will enter that sill under the cover that we talked about that covers the battery up. So you won't see that at all in the car. It runs down the inside of the sill, and then it's got to come out of the sill at the top, at the front. And it needs something to cover up where it runs up the inside of the kick panel. So all of those factors work quite well together, in that if we designed a speaker mounting that gave us enough room for the magnet on the speaker to clear the kick panel, and enough room to run the wire up the inside of that kick panel area, it meant our trim panel could sit over, have a return edge at the back, and be spaced off enough to cover the wiring. And we could use the speaker to actually mount the panel exactly as we have done in the back. So Scott's made these lovely plasma cut brackets that bolt onto threaded bosses, which is welded to the inside of the kick panel, and then the trim panel will sit over that. The speaker will pin it into the bracket, so that will actually retain it, so no visible fixings on the panel itself, and then the wiring will go up behind that trim panel. So that's really worked out well in terms of a neat design there. Lastly, let's go and have a look at the Chevette. Excusez-moi, s'il vous plaît. Percussive adjustment. Yeah. That sounds like hammering. Awesome. So Chevette. The familiar body shop routine of putting stuff on and sanding it off again. But we are making good progress on this now. It's the fibreglass Bodykit misery is we're well versed in around here. typically nothing fits without enormous amounts of change, and everything's incredibly ripply. So we're basically in the stages at the moment of trying to smooth out all of that fiberglass and get the fit of everything to work properly, which is traumatic. I mean, even things like the door shuts, the fiberglass is so thick in the area on the back of the wing here that when you try and open the door, the front edge of the door actually hits the back of the fiberglass, and if you actually sand that out enough to get the clearance, it sands completely through. So you end up having to build up the inside of the wing at the back here to give yourself enough material to allow you to sand it forward and in from the back there to give the clearance to open the doors. And that sort of theme basically repeats throughout these fiberglass kits. It's basically one problem solving item after another, but we're getting there. Actually really broken the back of it, and the bulk of the filler work and block sanding on the steel panels is done. We've also louvered the bonnet, which was something I think Nat mentioned we were going to do last week. When the last one of these we built, we actually used a fiberglass bonnet on it, which you can get with a slight hump, but it doesn't need that for clearance. And the bonnet was such a terrible fit that we were reluctant to go through that trauma again. I remember clearly that the shape of it didn't match the front panel at all. It was just really low in the middle and really high at the sides, to the point where we had to put a buffer in the middle so that when you pinned the bonnet down at the sides, it actually pulled it down to be the matching shape. And of course the other problem with fiberglass bonnets is the finish on the underside. Because it's the B surface, it takes a huge amount of sanding of that B surface on the fiberglass to get it to look even half decent, and even then they don't look perfect. So we were reluctant to use the fiberglass bonnet. But we did want to add something that set it apart from just your bog standard Chevette bonnet, something that tied in with the aggressive look of the rest of the car, and we're also keen to maximise the amount of heat that can escape from the engine bay. So we decided to just punch some louvers in, so good old-fashioned fly press with a punch tool. Gaz was doing that last week, and well, I can't remember what your message to me was. I was off that day, and it was something like, yeah, we're about to scrap a bonnet. And my message back was, right, I'll get on eBay now and start looking for a replacement. So I never heard anything the rest of Friday, so I was pleased to see when I came in on Monday that it had all gone well.
It was 3 people doing it.
Yeah. So all good fun, but yeah, we're just bashing through. They've started a bit of prep work on the inside of the doors as well. On the luxury model Chevettes, shall we say, they thought it made all the difference to extend the interior door trim panel right to the bottom of the door. It normally finished higher up and sat into a rectangular recess on the door. But to sort of set apart a higher spec level, they extended it to the bottom and drilled a load of holes around that it clipped into. Now, because we're doing carbon fibre panels, I wanted them to sit into that original rectangular recess. It looks a lot neater, slightly recessed in. But consequently, we had to delete the I don't know what even trim spec it was, LX or something, but we had to delete those holes. So in welding those, it adds a bit of distortion. So they've just been given a bit of a skim and block sanding the bottom of the inside of the door to make sure that's perfect. And so yeah, it's just going to be forging ahead. Anyway, out of the dust zone, let's see you next week. Bye. Bye.